Welcome to the inaugural episode of the MMA Pick'ems podcast for UFC Fight Island 7, headlined by Max Holloway versus Calvin Kattar. I'm your host, Ray, and I'll be breaking down each fight on this card and giving you my predictions, betting tips, and analysis. I'll be going over bets that I've placed and also leans that I have. You can check out my Bet MMA tips page at betmma.tips/picksbyray, where I post all my official picks, which I'll have in the link for in the description below. As of right now, there are 12 fights on the card. There have been a number of dropouts and replacements, but I'll upload new videos if any fights get added or changed. But without further ado, let's get right into it. In the first fight of the night, we have Jacob Kilburn versus Austin Lingo, and this should be a fun one. We have two low-level fighters with a lot of power in their hands going at it. I think there's a good chance someone is getting knocked out this fight. First thing to note is Kilburn does have a deadly right hand, at least on the regional level. He does have pretty awkward movement as well on the feet, but is good at moving his head and timing the counter. His downside is his abysmal ground game, though. He's able to starch guys on the regional scene, but it seems every time he gets to step up in competition, he just gets taken down and absolutely mauled on the ground, like in his fights against Bobby Moffett and Billy Quarantillo. And on the other side, we have Austin Lingo, who is primarily a striker as well and also has a deadly right hand. I actually think these guys match up pretty similarly, since Lingo hasn't shown too much in the grappling department either. Even though the obvious game plan would be to take Kilburn down, I haven't seen enough from Lingo to think he'll do that. So if it stays standing, I think the fight will play out pretty close. Kilburn has better head movement and seems a little more accurate, while Lingo seems to have the better combination striking. I think both guys are live for the KO, but the minus 220 price tag on Lingo seems a little absurd. He would have to execute a grapple-heavy game plan or knock Kilburn out early to justify that. And that is possible, but I think Kilburn has a much better shot in this fight than the odds indicate. I'd say this fight is close to 50-50, maybe a slight lean on Lingo. I think I'm going to go with the underdog here and take Kilburn. I'm really hoping this fight stays standing. I've already put 0.2 units on Kilburn by KO at plus 650 odds. The under 2.5 is plus 110, which is very intriguing to me. Very heavily considering putting a unit on that. Both guys have knockout power, and neither of them are defensively sound fighters. Maybe the bookies are expecting Lingo to take this to the ground and grind him out for a win, but I think the fight will stay standing, and 2.5 rounds is plenty of time for one to land clean on the other. So the pick here is Kilburn with a 0.2 unit bet on Kilburn via KO or TKO at plus 650, but not much confidence here since it is a low-level fight. I am considering the under 2.5 as well. And in this next fight, we have Sarah Moras versus Vanessa Melo. And guys, this is a total bum fight in my opinion. Clash of cans, if you will. Honestly, this should be a fight where the loser gets cut and the winner gets cut too. Shit. Moras is 6-6, not looking good with that 500 record, and she's 1-4 in her last 5, with her only win against Liana Jojua, who's terrible as well. I mean, her nickname is Cheesecake, which honestly should say it all. Moras isn't very athletic or skilled. She really just has an overhand right that she uses and has a really poor ground game. In most of her UFC fights, she's either out-grappled or out-boxed. I really want to fade Moras, but Melo is just as bad. She's arguably even less skilled and less athletic than Cheesecake Moras. Only thing she has going for her are her massive thighs, and that's pretty much it. I remember in one of her fights, the first thing Bisping pointed out were her thunder thighs. I always think it's a big tell for how bad a fighter is when the commentators mention points about them that are kind of unrelated to their fighting ability. Like, commentators usually will hype a fighter by saying stuff like, this guy has massive power, or she's a submission wizard, not, look at them thighs. Anyways, Melo just seems really slow and has no pop in her punches. She mainly just throws jabs and pitter-patter 1-2s. She's also doesn't have much of a ground game either. It does look like she has faced slightly better opponents than Moras, but not by much. And as far as the matchup goes, and you guys will probably never hear me say this again, but I do slightly favor Moras here. I think she'll actually be able to land that overhand right on Melo, who's slow as shit. I also think she may be the better wrestler, but I have no confidence in the grappling of either fighter. But minus 245 is ridiculous. Melo is bad, but Moras isn't much better. If the fight stays standing, it'll be close. Melo might even be able to steal a decision by outvoluming Moras with her pitter-patter punches. The pick is Moras, but I might just put half a unit on Melo at plus 210 because this line is crazy. I'll update that on my Bet MMA tips page if I do lock it in though. Moving ahead to the next fight, we have the plus 215 underdog David Zawada versus the minus 255 favorite Ramazan Emeev. And this fight has stinker written all over it. It's two low output guys going at it, which is why I don't think Emeev should be a minus 255 favorite at all. I'll dive more into this in just a second, but first I want to shift the focus to Zawada. Zawada is 1-2 in the UFC with his only win against Abubakar Nurmagomedov, who, despite his last name, is nowhere close to Khabib's level. And it was somewhat fluky win since Abubakar left himself wide open for that triangle choke. But good for Zawada for noticing and locking that in. That being said, though, Zawada isn't really a grappler and prefers to keep the fight standing. He's pretty low volume striker himself and mainly just throws jabs and hooks. It looks like he gets a little bit predictable as well since he doesn't really mix up his striking. You could see that in his fight against Li Jingliang, where Li really started to get a read on Zawada and started going off on him in the third. Overall, Zawada's a pretty one-dimensional fighter where if he's not getting the finish, he won't do too well in the scorecards. Luckily for him, though, he's going against another low output fighter in Emeev. Aside from having such a punchable face, Emeev just has such a boring fight style. He's been a total decisionator since joining the UFC. He'll spend whole chunks of fights just staring at his opponent. I don't think he's landed more than 40 significant strikes in a fight. I mean, he'll shoot for a takedown to end the round, but outside of that, he's not doing much to get ahead on the scorecards. And even on the ground, he's not doing much. I'm surprised he keeps coming in as such a heavy favorite. I really hope the UFC matches him up against someone decent enough that'll expose his boring fight style. As far as how the fight plays out, though, I think it'll be a low-paced boxing match. I think they'll go toe-to-toe in the striking exchanges, maybe with Emeev coming ahead just a little bit, and with Emeev likely shooting for the takedown to win the rounds. I think Emeev will get the nod, but this fight will play out much closer than the line indicates. Like a lot of Emeev's fight, they play out pretty close. If he's not able to get the takedown or if Zawada starts to pull ahead a bit in the striking, the decision could very well swing Zawada's way, which is why I think this is a dog or pass fight. I wouldn't recommend putting money on Emeev or putting him in parlays either because he could very well fuck it all up. No bet here, but the pick is Emeev. Just can't really trust his output. And in the next fight, we have Justin Tafa, the plus 165 underdog, versus Carlos Felipe, the minus 190 favorite. This is your typical low-level heavyweight bout that the UFC loves to push. But let's start with Tafa, who, in my opinion, does not belong in the UFC. He made his UFC debut with only 3 professional fights on the Whitaker versus Adesanya card because they wanted a local fighter on the card, honestly. He got matched against Yorgan De Castro and got starched in the first round because he had no head movement at all and threw a super telegraphed overhand. And it was a pretty uneventful fight up until then also. And just to go on a quick little sidebar here, his opponent De Castro would actually go on to lose a boring decision to Greg Hardy before getting matched up against Carlos Felipe, who is tough as the next opponent. I think he was like a minus 250 favorite that fight, which is fucking nuts. I believe I had a half a unit bet on Felipe just because De Castro had no business being such a massive favorite, and it showed. He was outboxed by Felipe and literally got spanked by Felipe as he was holding him against the fence. I guess the moral of the story here is you can't really trust low-level heavyweights and that Tafa is awful. But with that being said, though, I actually think this line is pretty justified. I really do think Tafa is that bad. Felipe actually has decent boxing. He has quick hands for his size and does have some technique. He has good combination punching and works the body pretty frequently, which I love to see, especially for a heavyweight. You know, these guys have big old bellies and terrible cardio, so working the body is like the best thing you could do. I know I had my whole spiel about low-level heavyweight fights, but I really do think Felipe is miles ahead of Tafa in the striking. The minus 190 may seem a bit steep, but I think Felipe can comfortably outbox Tafa here. Tafa's only path to victory is KO, which, unlike him, is pretty slim. The pick here is Felipe, and I actually have him parlayed with someone later in the card. And in the next fight, we have Omari Akhmedov versus Tom Breese. This should be a pretty interesting fight. Tom Breese seems like a very promising prospect, and he's going against Akhmedov, who's been hanging around the top 15 for some time now. And I think it's because he's a very well-rounded fighter. Akhmedov has good kickboxing and good wrestling, but isn't really elite anywhere. He fights with a good defensive stance, but doesn't have much output offensively. The good thing is he will mix in the takedown, especially if he feels he has the advantage there. The dude is super jacked, and I think his cardio is somewhat suspect. It hasn't been super obvious in previous fights, but the Weidman fight really exposed it. There was a lot of wrestling in that fight, but Akhmedov gassed hard in the third round and was basically just on his back that whole round. So this does kind of explain why he has low output and why he really only wrestles to kind of cap off the round. Breese, on the other hand, is primarily a boxer. He has clean, crisp boxing and a powerful left hand, but I think he's still a little unproven in the UFC. It seems he hasn't been able to get the job done when he gets a step up in competition. His 2 losses were against Sean Strickland, who I think is pretty legit, and Brendan Allen, another solid prospect. So no shame in losing to those guys, but you can kind of get a feel for where Breese currently stands. And his last 2 wins were total layups against Daniel Kelly, who was 40 at the time, and KB Buhler, a certified cam. And you know how I mentioned earlier that the biggest tell a fighter sucks is when commentators will talk about anything but their fighting ability? Well, literally for his walk-in, the commentator said his favorite game is Pokemon Shield. Like, who gives a fuck? This is the fucking UFC, and he gets crumpled by a fucking jab. Honestly, it was pretty sad. So this is a pretty big step up for Breese, who's fighting a ranked opponent in Akhmedov after beating up a fucking accountant. I know the middleweight division is pretty shallow, but Akhmedov has fought and beaten decent opponents. Minus 145 isn't egregious or anything, but I don't think an unproven Breese should be the favorite here. He could completely prove me wrong here, but I haven't seen enough from him to make me think otherwise. Akhmedov is a sound defensive striker, and I think Breese might struggle a bit getting through the high guard of Akhmedov. Breese also did struggle with the grappling of Allen. Don't think Akhmedov has the pressure wrestling of Allen, but I think that is something he can take advantage of. This is a close one, but I think I'll have to go with Akhmedov here. He's the more proven fighter, and I think that his fight style could cause Breese some trouble. I think Akhmedov can keep it close on the feet and then use his wrestling to win the round. My main concern for Akhmedov is his cardio and his speed. Breese may be able to consistently beat Akhmedov to the punch, and if he doesn't have the cardio to consistently go to his wrestling, he may be fucked. I'm still picking Akhmedov here, but no bet. I may take a shot on Akhmedov if I can get a better number, maybe around like plus 50 or so. But as of right now, no bet. But the pick is in the next fight, we have Jocelyn Edwards, the plus 145 underdog, versus Wu Yanan, the minus 170 favorite. I'll keep this pretty short here because I think it's a pretty straightforward fight. Edwards is coming in on short notice against Yanan, who was originally scheduled to fight Betch Kohea, but Kohea withdrew. And I'll say it right now, I just think the line is completely off. Yanan should not be the favorite here. She has the UFC experience, but she's still very green and honestly very, very low level. She's 1-2 in the UFC, with her only win coming from a pretty fluky armbar. She's tall, but her reach isn't great, and her striking is very rudimentary. She primarily throws 1-2s and doesn't really seem to have much pop in her punches either. Physically, she's not very imposing either and tends to get bullied a bit in clinch situations, even against smaller fighters like Mizuki Inoue. Edwards will be making her UFC debut. She hasn't really been fighting high-level opponents on the regional scene, but neither has Yanan. I think Edwards is the better striker in this matchup. She has a nice jab, right hook, and body kick that she likes to throw. It also looks like she hits pretty hard too. Edwards does look like she struggles a bit with the grappling, but so does Yanan. I don't think either fighter will want to take this to the ground. It's likely going to be a stand-up fight, which I think Edwards will pull ahead in. I just think she's the much better striker here. So the pick is Edwards, and I will be putting 1 unit on her. And in the next fight, we have Nasruddin Imavov, the plus 140 underdog, versus Phil Hawes, the minus 160 favorite. This could be a good one as we have 2 action fighters going at it. Let's start with Imavov, who's 5-0 in his last 5 and is coming off a win in his UFC debut. I'll be honest here, I was only able to find tape on 2 of his most recent fights, but I was able to pick up a few tidbits of information to break this matchup down. In his second most recent fight, he went against Jonathan Munier, who he was able to TKO in the first round. I really liked the composure he showed in that fight. He had Munier rocked a few times early, but didn't overcommit and really waited to get the TKO. He didn't blow his load trying to chase the KO, and you like to see that, especially from a young fighter. Then in his next fight, he made his UFC debut against Jordan Williams, who, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is diabetic, and you really saw the effects of it in the second and third round when he gassed hard. It was honestly kind of impressive how he was able to get through the fight, running on fumes for the final 2 rounds, and not a particularly good look for Imavov, though, who looked like he was starting to tire too. He was able to ride it out, and what ended up being a pretty sloppy fight. With that being said, though, I am willing to give him a pass, as it was his UFC debut, and there was a clash of heads early in that fight, which may or may not have thrown him off his game a little bit. From a technical standpoint, Imavov does seem pretty light on his feet, has a solid jab, which I would like to see more of, and a nice straight right. He also does seem to have pretty good accuracy. I think he'll be the much crisper and fluid striker in this matchup. I haven't seen too much in regards to his wrestling, but it does seem like Imavov has a sneaky good submission game. He had a nice guillotine into figure four choke that he almost got against Williams. I don't think he's some submission wizard, but it looks like if you leave your neck open or limb exposed, he will snatch it up. And going over his record, it does look like he has a few interesting submission wins on his record as well. Overall, Imavov seems like a decent young fighter who has a lot of potential. Hawes, on the other hand, seems to be a bit of a busted prospect at this point, although I don't know if he really ever was considered a prospect. He made his UFC debut after his second stint on the Contender Series. He got knocked out from a nasty head kick in his first go on the Contender Series, but has bounced back with 5 knockout wins, with his most recent one against Jacob Malkoun in his UFC debut. Malkoun was making his UFC debut as well, but honestly did not deserve to be there. I mean, he was making his UFC debut after 4 fights, probably against janitors on the regional scene, if I'm being honest, and really only got the call because he's boys with Whitaker, who was also fighting on the same card. Malkoun had no business being in there. He looked super tentative and just out of place, and Hawes was able to make quick work of him. But as great as it is to be knocking guys out left and right, though, it makes it hard to gauge if he has really improved or if he's developed other facets of his game, especially since he's really only knocking out low-level guys. It doesn't really tell me much. Like, how is he going to do against someone who can withstand his striking or even put a bit of pressure on him? We haven't really seen that since the Marquez fight, so I think there are still some unknowns for Hawes. Overall, though, Hawes does seem like a very well-rounded fighter. He has heavy hands, explosive striking, and good wrestling, although it kind of seems like he hasn't really gone to the wrestling recently. It makes sense, though, since he's been knocking guys out, but I also suspect it's because the wrestling tires him out, and he has shown some cardio issues before. So going into this fight, I think Imavov has the slight striking advantage, while Hawes has the wrestling advantage. Hawes can keep it competitive on the feet, but will probably have to fall back on his wrestling to win rounds, because I think Imavov will pull ahead in the striking department if it stays standing. Both guys are pretty dangerous on the feet. Hawes has the explosiveness and Imavov has the accuracy to get the KO. The main concern for Hawes, though, is the cardio if he decides to grapple. He'll need to be smart about it and maybe only wrestle near the end of rounds to win the round, but there are risks involved with that, especially against Imavov, who I've mentioned before will snatch up a submission if Hawes leaves his neck or limb exposed. So Hawes will have to be careful when he's shooting for the takedown. I think this fight will play out close and will come down to the wrestling of Hawes. I think Hawes has the tools to win, but his cardio is just a bit too unreliable. But in terms of picks, I'm going to go with Hawes, but Imavov definitely is live in this situation. Not betting on this fight, but I just feel there are too many variables right now, especially with Hawes' cardio. But the pick is Hawes, but I am not betting on this fight. And in the next matchup, we have Punahele Soriano, the plus 137 underdog, versus Dusko Todorovic, the minus 157 favorite. This is an interesting matchup. The UFC is pitting 2 prospects against each other. I'm not sure why they're doing this, but it should make for a fun one. On one side, we have Punahele Soriano, who is 7-0 overall and 1-0 in the UFC. he is still pretty green, but does seem to pack a punch. He has quick hands and has shown he can put guys out on the regional scene. His level of competition is not that great, though. I actually think he had a tougher Contender Series matchup in Jamie Pickett than his UFC debut against Pihota. Soriano does come from a wrestling background, but it seems he is comfortable with throwing hands. However, it looks like he will go to the wrestling in tough situations like he showed in the Pickett fight. And on the other side, we have Dusko Todorovic, who is undefeated, 10-0 overall and 1-0 in the UFC. He seemed to be a bit of a hype prospect, but had a very disappointing showing in his Contender Series fight against Teddy Ash. He was a heavy favorite in that fight and got pretty noticeably outboxed. Luckily, he was able to pull away in the clinch exchanges, which seemed to be his bread and butter. Then the UFC tried to match him up with John Phillips multiple times, but that kept falling through, so they gave him Daquan Townsend instead. And if you haven't heard of those guys, they're two of the biggest cans the UFC has. They're basically just prospect fodder at that point. I don't know what Townsend is up to now, but I think they cut Phillips. Anyways, it's pretty obvious the UFC wants to build this guy up by giving him a layup fight. And as expected, he absolutely handled Townsend, ground and pounded him for 2 rounds before finally getting him out of there in the second. I don't think he'll have as easy of a matchup against Soriano. Soriano does seem to have decent offensive wrestling, although I'm not sure if that translates defensively. I think Soriano will have the better boxing, though. He'll have the quicker hands, crisper striking, and will likely be beating Dusko to the punch. However, I do favor Dusko way more in the clinch situations where he'll be landing body shots and elbows and be controlling the action. Dusko will also have the strength and size advantage, which favors him in this situation. I do have a bet placed on Dusko, but at a much lower price. It was at minus 120, I believe. I think there is still a bit of value here, at minus 157, but I think it really just comes down to if you think Dusko can keep the fight in the clinch. If he does, I think he'll look like a minus 200 favorite, but, if he's not able to hold Soriano there, Soriano could completely outbox him and just run away with the fight on the feet, but I think Dusko can get it done, though. He's fought the better competition, and I think he'll just be the bigger and more stronger fighter in this matchup. So I think he'll be able to use that to his advantage to really just control Soriano in the clinch and likely to win a decision here. So the pick is Dusko, and I did place a 1.2 unit bet on him earlier, although at minus 157, I think there is very, very little value on him at this point. Moving on to the next fight, we have Joaquin Buckley, the minus 260 favorite, versus Alessio De Chirico, the plus 220 underdog. And I'm pretty excited for this fight. De Chirico is a boring-ass fighter, but Buckley is building quite a bit of hype, and deservedly so. He's got some pretty spectacular KOs. I don't know if they voted on it yet, but that spinning back kick should definitely be a KO of the year. Aside from that, though, Buckley has a very exciting fight style. He brings a lot of pressure and always seems to be working. He doesn't really take anything off his punches either. His pace and power are just pretty crazy, honestly. It doesn't look like he lets up either. He hasn't gone to a decision yet in the UFC, but he seems to be able to maintain that pace for at least 2 rounds. His defense does get a little sloppy after about the first minute and a half, though, which could be very troublesome against higher level strikers. This could also leave openings for De Chirico, who has pretty heavy hands, but that's really all he has, though, at this point. He's one of those low output heavy hitters that I really don't like watching, and he's only had 1 KO as well, so he's not really out here starching guys left and right. And that KO was against Alawala Bambose, who's a total scrub. And for those of you unaware, Bambose was the guy who was throwing double, hammer fists against Costa. A very, very low-level guy. And, he did get knocked out by a knee, which Buckley has to watch out for since he ducks his head a bit sometimes, and he has to be careful when doing that against De Chirico here. I think Buckley should be able to get this done, though. I think his pressure will be too much for De Chirico. He throws heavy body shots and does a good job mixing up his shots. I think the accumulated damage will get to De Chirico, and the body shots will make him lower his guard, leaving the head open. I think Buckley can get the KO here if that happens. De Chirico has never been knocked out before and has only been dropped once, I think, and that was in his last fight against Cummings, and that was pretty much right at the last second as well. Doesn't mean Buckley can't get it done, though. I don't think De Chirico has fought anyone who can bring the pressure and volume like Buckley. The only concern is if Buckley respects the power of Chirico too much and it becomes a staring contest like most of Chirico's fights. That is a possibility, but more than likely, I think Buckley will fight like he normally does. I think the volume and the pressure may just be too much for Chirico. I could see Buckley either taking this to a decision and just winning on volume, or honestly just being able to knock Chirico out just based off of the accumulated damage. So the pick here is Buckley, and I do have him locked up in a parlay with Carlos Felipe. I did put 1 unit down on that at plus 111 for the parlay. And in the next fight, we have Santiago Ponzinibbio, the minus 285 favorite, versus Li Jingliang, the plus 245 underdog. I'm pretty excited to see the return of Ponzinibbio. He's a really fun fighter to watch, but is coming off a 2-year layoff because of a blood infection or something. And prior to his layoff, though, he was lighting dudes up. He had good wins against solid fighters at the time, like Nordine Taleb, Gunnar Nelson, and Mike Perry. And I do say at the time because these guys seemed like decent prospects before going on a losing skid. Ponzinibbio really likes to bring the action. He's a high-pressure, high-output fighter with fast and accurate hands. He throws heavy leg kicks as well and does a good job cutting off the cage. The main concern for him really is just the long layoff and the injury. Lee, on the other hand, is coming off a loss from a stinker of a fight against Magny nearly a year ago. He basically just got held against the cage and wasn't able to do shit against Magny. I honestly don't quite know how I feel about Lee. He's a counterpuncher, and most of the time he's backing up or circling, just looking to land that clean counter shot. I wouldn't say he's a low output fighter, but he's borderline. He'll go off on lower level guys, but against decent strikers, he'll take way too much time before making his reads and landing his shot. He has been getting it done so far in the UFC, but the level of competition has been rather lackluster. As far as how the fight will play out, I think Ponzinibbio will be the one taking initiative. He'll try to back Lee up against the cage and unload on him. He'll probably throw some heavy leg kicks to stifle the movement of Lee a bit. I honestly don't think Lee will have too much to offer Ponzinibbio on the feet. This could potentially be a very lopsided fight, but the long layoff for Ponzinibbio is a very, very concerning. Supposedly he had a bone and blood infection and is also suffering from arthritis. You really have to wonder how that has affected his training, like if he's been getting the same reps in or just the physical toll it's taken on his body. And for that reason, I do think the line is a little inflated. Even for pre-injury Ponzinibbio, this line shouldn't be this wide. Lee has a pretty potent straight right, and if Ponzinibbio doesn't finish him in the first 2 rounds, he could slow down and get caught by Lee. And as much as I don't really like Lee's fighting style, it works. He'll sit back for a couple rounds to make his reads and get his timing down and take advantage of any opening you leave him. So, the pick here is Ponzinibbio, but actually might sprinkle a little bit on and in the co-main event, we have Carlos Condit, the minus 170 favorite, against Matt Brown, the plus 145 underdog. This could be a banger. We have 2 vets who prefer to strike and are in the tail ends of their careers. Their offensive striking and power are still there, but their athleticism and reaction times have faded pretty considerably. And I like that the UFC is matching vets against each other instead of feeding them to up-and-coming prospects. Like, prior to his win against Court McGee, who has quite a bit of wear and tear himself, Condit was on a 5-fight lose streak. After his war with Lawler, he dropped fights to Maia, Magny, Alex Oliveira, and Chiesa. I mean, these guys are all pretty solid fighters, but they were all just younger fighters who were able to take advantage of Condit's poor wrestling defense. Condit's only 36, but dude's like 50 in fight years. He's still good enough to style on other old guys like Court McKee, but just can't really get it done against the younger guys. Condit looked pretty sharp against McGee, but again, McGee is kind of, shop-worn himself and not nearly as skilled. We have a similar situation with Matt Brown. He's well past his prime and really should just be fighting other aging vets. He did look really good against Baeza in his most recent fight, though. He was putting pressure on Baeza and actually had him rocked for a few moments in the first round. Brown was really letting his hands go, and you could tell he still has power, but the commentators put it really well. The power and the technique are there, but the defense isn't. He just wasn't able to see and react to the punches like he used to. And pretty much right on cue, Brown gets starched by Baeza from a right hook. And as far as how the fight will play out, I think Brown will start strong and be putting the pressure on Condit early. And as much wear and tear Condit's body has accumulated, he still seems to have a solid chin. I actually think the fight will play out pretty close if it's standing, with Condit starting to pull away in the later 2 rounds. Where the line is right now seems a little bit wide, just a bit slightly. I do favor Condit here, but I don't think he should be that big of a favorite. I mean, the durability of Brown is definitely a bit iffy, so I can see why people are on Condit here. As far as the grappling goes, I don't think either fighter will want to go there, as it wouldn't be a really good use of their energy at this stage in their career. So the pick here is Condit, but I won't be betting on this fight. I'll probably just sit back and enjoy this one. And finally, we're here at the main event. Calvin Kattar, the plus 138 underdog, versus Max Holloway, the minus 158 favorite. This is such an interesting and exciting matchup between two high-level strikers. On one side, we have Calvin Kattar, who's really been putting it together recently and has some of the slickest boxing in the division. And he'll be going up against Max Holloway, the former champ, one of the most dynamic and exciting strikers in the division. This is a big fight for both guys. For Kattar, it's to prove he's a top dog in the division, and a win here could set him up for a title shot. And for Max, he'll need a win here to keep himself in title contention and to avoid a 3-fight lose streak, regardless of how you feel about that Volkanovski rematch. I'll start with Calvin Kattar, who's 4-1 in his last 5, with his only loss being to Zabit, which I'll dive into a little bit more. He's also had some notable wins against Ricardo Lamas, Jeremy Stevens, and Dan Ige, all solid fighters. He outboxed Ige for 5 rounds in his first 5-rounder and knocked out Stevens, Lamas, and Shane Burgos in pretty spectacular fashion. He did drop one to Moicano a little while back, who kicked the shit out of Kattar's leg and kind of exposed a hole in Kattar's style. He also lost to Zabit in a fight where he started kind of slow and Zabit just ran away with the first 2 rounds. Something to note, though, from that fight, Zabit did gas the fuck out in the 3rd round. He had completely, burned through his gas tank and had nothing left. Like halfway through the 3rd round, he was just hanging on Kattar and just getting his head beat like a bongo for 2.5 minutes. Without a doubt, if that was a 5-rounder, Kattar would have taken that. With that said, though, those 2 losses exposed a part of Kattar's game that Max, might be able to take advantage of. One of those being the leg kicks, and Moicano was the first to really take advantage of it, and some other fighters have implemented it too. Kattar stands heavy on that lead leg, and that leaves him exposed to leg kicks. Over a 5-round fight, that'll hamper his mobility and make it harder for him to put weight on it and really land his heavier shots. Fortunately for him, though, Max isn't really a leg kicker. He did use some leg kicks in the Volkanovski rematch, but that was really just an adjustment from their previous fight to match the volume of Volkanovski. He wasn't really using it to do serious damage, if that makes sense. The other issue with Kattar is he tends to start a little slow. He'll usually take the first round or so to get a read on his opponent and to get his timing down. And in his fight with Zabit, I think he was struggling to get a read on Zabit because of the diversity of his striking. He was never able to really get into a rhythm because Zabit was constantly changing it up. And Kattar was really only able to start pouring it on Zabit after Zabit got gassed. Max isn't going to get gassed, but he also won't be giving the same looks as Zabit. So as far as weaknesses go for Kattar, I'd say it's his leg kicks and being a bit of a slow starter. However, Kattar has very sound defensive boxing. He keeps a nice tight high guard and has very good head movement. He also has really good footwork, and once he gets into a rhythm, he'll really start to pour it on his opponents. I think a 5-rounder is favorable for Kattar, as he'll start to pick up momentum late in the second and into the 3rd and championship rounds. I know people will favor Max in a 5-rounder because of the volume and pressure he brings, along with the 5-round fights he's been in, which is understandable, but Max is very hittable, and this could be disastrous against an elite boxer like Kattar. Also, Max arguably dropped those last 2 rounds against Volkanovski, the rounds when he's usually picking it up. So, the issue I have with this matchup for Max is he does tend to struggle with high-level strikers who do have size on him. And he really struggles with, exiting the pocket after exchanges as well. After, landing his shots, he leaves his chin exposed and ends up taking a lot of damage. I think in a 5-round fight, Kattar is going to get that timing down and start landing heavy shots on Max. Max will bring the volume, but Kattar will probably be doing more damage. For Max to do well, he'll really have to keep the pressure on Kattar either by backing up to the fence or just tying him up after exchanges to really limit the return damage that he's taking. He'll also need to work on the leg kicks of Kattar, so I really, hope that, he's been drilling those leg kicks, This, it's going to be a really close fight, and honestly, I think it should be close to a pick 'em with Max being a slight favorite. Obviously, Max has a significant experience advantage, but I think Kattar is a tough stylistic matchup for Max. For me, Kattar still needs to prove he can handle that step up in competition. He's fallen a bit flat when he has before, but I don't think Max necessarily brings to the table what Moicano and Zabit does, though. I really like Max and do hope he wins, but I think I'll have to pick Kattar here. As far as the bet goes, I might put a unit on Kattar because I really do think this is close to a 50-50 fight. I haven't locked it in yet, but if I do, I'll be sure to put it on my Bet MMA tips page. Again, the pick here is Kattar in what I think is a really close fight, but no bet just yet. And that is it, folks. We have gone through the whole card. And just to give a quick recap of my picks, which I will have in the description as well, I have Kilburn, Moras, Emeev, Felipe, Akhmedov, Edwards, Hawes, Todorovic, Buckley, Ponzinibbio, Condit, and Kattar. As far as bets go, I have 1.2 units on Todorovic at minus 120, although I think there still is a little bit of value at minus 157 now. I also have 1 unit on Edwards at plus 145, and for the parlay, I have Felipe and Buckley parlayed at for 1 unit at plus 111. Lastly, I do have a 0.2 unit prop bet on Kilburn as well by KO or TKO. And that'll do it for the podcast, guys. Take care and best of luck, everyone.